Chapter 11, Part 1 of From Sail to Steam by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Turning of a Long Lane. Historical, Naval, and Personal. 1870. Part 1. In narrating the cruise of the Iroquois, I have, as it were, laid the reins on the neck of my memory, letting it freely run away, partly because our track lay over stretches of sea even now somewhat unbeaten by travel, partly because the story of routine naval life and incidental experiences in a time already far past might have for the non-professional reader more novelty than could be premised by me, a daily participant therein. Moreover, there were in our cruise some exceptional occurrences which might be counted upon to relieve monotony. I propose to observe greater restraint in what follows. The year 1870, in which I returned home, was one of marked and decisive influence upon history, and in a way a turning point in my own obscure career. As in February I witnessed the splendors of the papal city under its old regime, so in April and May I saw imperial Paris brilliant under the emperor. In the one case, as in the other, I was unconscious of the approaching debacle, a blindness, I presume, shared by most contemporaries. Whatever the wiser and more far-seeing might have prophesied as to the general ultimate issues, few or none could then have foretold the particular occasion which so soon afterwards opened the floodgates. As the old passed with the downfall of the French Empire and of the temporal kingdom, there arose a new, not merely the German Empire and the unity of Italy, crowned by the possession of its historic capital, but unrecognized for the moment. Then came in that reign of organized and disciplined force, the full effect and function of which in the future men still only dimly discern. The successive rapid overthrows of the Austrian and French empires by military efficiency and skill, the beating in detail two separate foes who, united, might have been too strong for the victor, the consequent crumbling of the papal monarchy when French support was withdrawn, following closely on the Vatican decree of infallibility. These things produced an impression which was transmitted rapidly throughout the world of European civilization, till in the farther East it reached Japan. Into the current thus established, the petty stream of my own fortunes was drawn, little anticipated by myself. To it was due my special call, for by it was created the predisposition to recognize the momentous bearing of maritime force upon the course of history, which ensured me a hearing when the fullness of my time was come. Until 1870, my life since graduation had been passed afloat almost without interruption. Soon afterwards I obtained command rank, and this promotion, combined with the dead apathy which after the War of Secession settled upon our people with regard to the Navy, left me with relatively little active employment for several years. In America, the naval stagnation of that period was something now almost incredible. The echoes of the guns which from Königsgrätz and a dozen battlefields in France had resounded round the globe, awakening the statesmen of all countries, had apparently ricocheted over the United States, as fog sound signals are noticed to rebound overhead, unheard through long stretches of the sea level, until they again touch the water beyond. The nation slumbered peacefully in its petit coin, to use the expressive phrase of a French admiral to me. Had even nothing been done, this inertness might have been less significant; but somewhere in the early '70s, despite all the progress elsewhere noticeable, there were built deliberately some half-dozen corvettes, smaller than the Iroquois class, mostly of wood. That a period of lethargy in action should steal over a government just released from strenuous exertion is one thing, and bad enough; but it is different, and much worse, that there should be a paralysis of idea, of mental development corresponding to the movement of the world. I myself have always considered that the right about of policy came with the administration of President Arthur, when Mr. Chandler was Secretary of the Navy. It began with a work of destruction, an exposure of the uselessness of the existing naval material, due purely to stand still, to being left hopelessly in the rear of the march of improvement elsewhere. Upon this followed, under the same administration, an attempt at restoration, gingerly enough in its conceptions. The vessels laid down were cruisers, the primary quality of which should be speed, but 14 knots was the highest demanded, and that of only one, the Chicago. Unhappily, wherever the fault lay, the navy then had the habit of living from day to day on expedients, on makeshifts. Although deficiencies were manifest and generally felt, the prevailing sentiment had been that we should wait until the experiments of other peoples, in the cost of which we would not share, should have reached workable finalities. This is another instance of what is commonly called practical, as though mental processes must not necessarily antecede efficient action, and as though there was not then at hand abundant data for brains to work on, without any expenditure of money. Finality, indeed, had not been reached, and never will be in anything save death, but at that time it had been shown, beyond peradventure, that radically new conditions had entered naval warfare, and clearly the first most practical step was a mature official digestion of these conditions, a decision as to what types of vessels were needed, and what their respective qualities should be. In short, the first and perfectly possible thing was to evolve a systematic policy, a careful look, and then a big leap. However, things rarely come about in that way. It involves getting rid of old ideas, which is quite as bad as pulling teeth, and much harder, and the subsequent adoption of new ones that are as uneasy as tight shoes. We had then certain accepted maxims, dating mainly from 1812, which were so thoroughly current in the country, and I fear in the navy too, as the dollar of the daddies was not long after. One was that commerce destroying was the great efficient weapon of naval warfare. Everybody, the navy as well, believed we had beaten Great Britain in 1912, brought her to her knees, by the destruction of her commerce through the system observed by us of single cruisers, naval or privateers. From that erroneous premise was deduced the conclusion of a navy of cruisers, and small cruisers at that, no battleship nor fleets. Then we wanted a navy for coast defense only, no aggressive action in our pious souls. An amusing instance being that our first battleships were styled coast defense battleships, a nomenclature which probably facilitated the appropriations. They were that, but they were capable of better things, as the event has proved. But the very fact that such talk passed unchallenged as that about commerce destroying by scattered cruisers, and war by mere defense, known to all military students as utterly futile and ruinous, shows the need then existent of a comprehensive survey of the contemporary conditions of the world and of the stage which naval material had reached. One such was made, with a subsequent secretary, Mr. Tracy, characterized to me as excellent, but the deficiencies and requirements exposed by it in our naval status frightened Congress, much as the confronting of his affairs terrify a bankrupt. During the latter part of Secretary Chandler's term, I was abroad in command of the Wachusett on the Pacific coast. Besides her, the squadron consisted of the Hartford, Farragut's old flagship, the Lackawanna, and my former ship, the Iroquois. They all dated, guns as well, from the War of Secession, or earlier. Had they been exceptional instances on a station of no great importance, it might not have mattered greatly, but in fact they still remained representative components of the United States Navy. The squadron organization, too, was that which had prevailed ever since I entered the service, and so continued until a very few years ago. The rule was that the vessels were scattered, one to this port, another to that. They rarely met, except for interchange of duties, and when in company almost the only exercises in common were those of yards and sails, in which the ships worked competitively to beat one another's time, a healthy enough emulation. But this rivalry was no substitute for the much more necessary practice of working together in mutual support, for the acquired habit of handling vessels in rapid movement and close proximity with fearless judgment, based upon experience of what your own could do, and what might be confidently expected from your consorts, especially your next ahead and astern. A new captain for the Lackawanna accompanied me to the station, where we found our ships in Callao, assembled with the other two. Within a week later we all went out together, performed 3 or 4 simple evolutions, and then scattered. This was the only fleet drill we had in 2 years, 1883 to 1885. In fact, from time immemorial the Navy has thought in single ships, as the Army had in company posts. To the several officers their own ship was everything, the squadron little or nothing. The War of Secession had broadened the ideas of the Army by enlarging its operations in the field, although peace brought a relapse; but the Navy, having to fight only shore batteries, not fleets, was not forced out of the old tactical and strategic apathy. The huge accumulation of vessels under a single admiral entailed enlarged administrative duties, but the tactical methods, as shown in the greater battles, presented simply the adaptation of means to a particular occasion, and however sagacious in the several instances, and they usually were sagacious, possessed no continuity of system in either theory or practice. Organic unity did not exist except for administration. There was an assemblage of vessels, but not a fleet. All this was the result, or at least the complement, of the theory of commerce destroying, which prescribed cruisers that act singly, and of war by defense only, which proscribed battleships that act in unison and so compel unity. A further incident of Mr. Chandler's tenure of office was the establishment of the Naval War College at Newport. This had its origin in the recognition of a defect in the constitution of the Navy Department which was glaringly visible during the War of Secession. Immense and admirable as was the administrative work done by the department during that contest, there did not exist in it then, nor did there for many years to come, any formal provision for the proper consideration and expert decision of strictly military questions, from the point of view of military experience and professional understanding. The head of the department, invariably a civilian under our form of government, and therefore usually unfamiliar with naval matters, had not assured to him, at instant call, organized professional assistance, individual or corporate, prepared to advise him when asked as to the military aspect of proposed operations, what the arguments for or against feasibility, or what the best method of procedure. In other services, notably in the German army, this function is discharged by the General Staff, nothing correspondent to which was to be found in our Navy Department. It is evident that the constitution of a General Staff, or of any similar body called into being for such a purpose, will be more broadly based and sounder as knowledge of the subjects in question is more widely distributed among the officers of the service, and that such knowledge will be imparted most certainly by the creation of an institution for the systematic study of military operations by land or sea, applying the experiences of history to contemporary conditions, and to the particular theaters of possible war in which the nation may be interested. Such studies are the object of the Naval War College, which was established upon the report of a board of officers, at the head of which was the present Rear Admiral Stephen B. Luce, to whose persistent initiative must be attributed much of the movement which thus resulted. The other members of the board were the late Admiral Sampson and Commander, now Rear Admiral, Caspar F. Goodrich. Luce became the first president of the institution, for which the department assigned a building once an almshouse, situated on Coaster's Harbor Island in Narragansett Bay, then recently ceded to the United States government. It remained still to get together a staff of instructors, and he wrote me to ask if I would undertake the subjects of naval history and naval tactics. The proposition was to me very acceptable, for I had found the Pacific station disagreeable, and although without proper preparation, I believed on reflection that I could do the work. During my last tour of shore duty I had read carefully Napier's Peninsular War, and found myself in a new world of thought, keenly interested and appreciative, less of the brilliant narrative, though that few can fail to enjoy, than of the military sequences of cause and effect. The influence of Sir John Moore's famous march to Sahagun, less famous than it deserves to be, upon Napoleon's campaign in Spain, revealed to me by Napier, like the sun breaking through a cloud, aroused an emotion as joyful as the luminary himself to a navigator doubtful of his position. Then felt I as some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific. Following this, I had written by request a volume on the Navy in the War of Secession, entitled The Gulf and Inland Waters, my first appearance as an author. Herein also I had recognized that the same class of military ideas took possession of my mind. I felt, therefore, that I should bring interest and understanding to my task, and hoped that the defects of knowledge, which I clearly realized, would be overcome. I recalled also that at the Military Academy my father, though professor only of engineering, military and civil, had of his own motion introduced a course of strategy and grand tactics which had commended itself to observers. I trusted, therefore, that heredity, too, might come to my aid. As acceptance placed me on the road which led directly to all the success I have had in life, I feel impelled to acknowledge my indebtedness to Admiral Luce. With little constitutional initiative, and having grown up in the atmosphere of the single cruiser, of commerce destroying, defensive warfare, and indifference to battleships, an anti-imperialist, who for that reason looked upon Mr. Blaine as a dangerous man. At 45 I was drifting on the lines of simple respectability as aimlessly as one very well could. My environment had been too much for me. My present call changed it. Meantime, however, there was delay. A relief would not be sent because the ship was to go home, and the ship did not go home because there was, first, a revolution in Panama, and then a war between the Central American states, both which required the Wachusett's presence. Mr. Cleveland was elected at this time. There was a change of administration, and with a new secretary a lapse of departmental interest. The ship did not go to San Francisco until September 1885, nearly a year after the admiral's proposition reached me. The year had not been unfruitful, however. Naturally predisposed, as I have said, my mind ran continually on my subject. I imagined various formations for developing to the best effect the powers of steamships, and sudden changes to be instituted as the moment of collision approached, calculated to disconcert the opponent, or to surprise an advantage before he could parry. Spinning cobwebs out of one's unassisted brain, without any previous absorption from external sources, was doubtless a somewhat crude process. Yet it had advantages. One of my manoeuvres was to pass a column of ships by an unexpected flank movement across the head of the enemy's column. This I have since heard called capping, if at least I correctly understand that word. Putting it afterwards before a body of officers attending the college course, all men of years and experience, one said to me derisively, "Do you suppose an enemy would let you do that?" "It is a question of how quick he is," I replied. "In these days of 12 or 15 knots he will have no time to ponder, and scarcely time to act." The query illustrates a habit of mind frequently met. It is like discussing the merits of a thrust en carte. If the other man is quick enough, he will parry. If not, he will be run through. Sooner or later, the more skillful usually will get in. Naval history gave me more anxiety, and I afterwards found it was that which Luce particularly desired of me. I shared the prepossession, common at the time, that the naval history of the past was wholly past, of no use at all to the present. I well recall, during my first term at the college, a visit from a reporter of one of the principal New York journals. He was a man of rotund presence, florid face, thrown back head, and flowing hair, with all that magisterial condescension which the environment of the Fourth Estate nourishes in its fortunate members. The Roman citizen was not in it for birthright. To my bad luck, a plan of Trafalgar hung in evidence as he stalked from room to room. "Ah," he said, with superb up-to-date pity, "you are still talking about Trafalgar." And I could see that Trafalgar and I were thenceforth on the top shelf of fossils in the collection of his memory. This point of view was held by very many. "You won't find much to say about history," was the direct discouraging comment of an older officer. On the other hand, Sir Geoffrey Hornby, less well known in this country than in Great Britain, where 20 years ago he was recognized as the head of the profession, distinctly commended to me the present value of naval history. I myself, as I have just confessed, had had the contrary impression, a tradition passively accepted. Thus my mind was troubled how to establish relations between yesterday and to day, so wholly ignorant was I of the undying reproduction of conditions in their essential bearings, a commonplace of military art. He who seeks finds, if he does not lose heart; and to me, continuously seeking, came from within the suggestion that control of the sea was an historic factor which had never been systematically appreciated and expounded. Once formulated consciously, this thought became the nucleus of all my writing for 20 years then to come. And here I may state at once what I conceive to have been my part in popularizing, perhaps in making effective, an argument for which I could by no means claim the rights of discovery. Not to mention other predecessors, with the full roll of whose names I am even now unacquainted, Bacon and Raleigh, 3 centuries before, had epitomized in a few words the theme on which I was to write volumes. That they had done so was indeed then unknown to me. For me, as for them, the light dawned first on my inner consciousness. I owed it to no other man. It has since been said by more than one that no claim for originality could be allowed me, and that I wholly concede. What did fall to me was, that no one since those 2 great Englishmen had undertaken to demonstrate their thesis by an analysis of history, attempting to show from current events, through a long series of years, precisely what influence the command of the sea had had upon definite issues. In brief, a concrete illustration. In the preface to my first work on the subject, for the success of which I was quite unprepared, I stated as my aim an estimate of the effect of sea power upon the course of history and the prosperity of nations, resting upon a collection of special instances, in which the precise effect has been made clear by an analysis of the conditions at the given moments. This field had been left vacant, yielding me my opportunity, and concurrently therewith, untouched from the point of view proposed by me, there lay the whole magnificent series of events constituting maritime history since the days of Raleigh and Bacon, after the voyages of Columbus and Da Gama gave the impetus to oversea activities, colonies, and commerce, which distinguishes the past 300 years. Even of this limited period I have occupied but a part, though I fear I have skimmed the cream of that which it offers; but back behind it lie virgin fields, in the careers of the Italian republics, and others yet more remote in time, which can never be for me to narrate, although I have examined them attentively. I cannot now reconstitute from memory the sequence of my mental processes. But while my problem was still wrestling with my brain, there dawned upon me one of those concrete perceptions which turn inward darkness into light, give substance to shadow. The Wachusett was lying at Callao, the seaport of Lima, as dull a coast town as one could dread to see. Lima being but an hour distant, we frequently spent a day there, the English club extending to us its hospitality. In its library was Mommsen's History of Rome, which I gave myself to reading, especially the Hannibalic episode. It suddenly struck me, whether by some chance phrase of the author I do not know, how different things might have been could Hannibal have invaded Italy by sea, as the Romans often had Africa, instead of by the long land route, or could he, after arrival, have been in free communication with Carthage by water. This clue, once laid hold of, I followed up in the particular instance. It and the general theory already conceived threw on each other reciprocal illustration, and between the two my plan was formed by the time I reached home in September 1885. I would investigate coincidentally the general history and naval history of the past 2 centuries, with a view to demonstrating the influence of the events of the one upon the other. Original research was not within my scope, nor was it necessary to the scheme thus outlined. Perhaps it is only a subtle form of egotism, but as a condition of my life experience I could wish to convey to others an appreciation of my profound ignorance of both classes of history when I began, being then 45. Not that I mean to imply that now, or at any time since, I have deluded myself with the imagination that I have become an historian after the high modern pattern. I tackle my job much as I presume an immigrant begins a clearing in the wilderness, not troubling greatly which tree he takes first. I laid my hands on whatever came along, reading with the profound attention of one who is looking for something, and the something was kind enough to acknowledge my devotion by shining forth in unexpected ways and places. Any line of investigation, however unsystematic in method, branches out in many directions, suggests continually new sources of information to one interested in his work, and I have felt constantly the force of Johnson's dictum as to the superior profit from time spent in reading what is congenial over the drudgery of constrained application. Every faculty I possessed was alive and jumping. Incidentally, I took up the study of land warfare, using Jomini and Hamley. For naval history, the first book upon which I chanced, the word is exact, was just what I needed at that stage. It was a history of the French Navy, by a Lieutenant Lapérouse Bonfils, published about 1845. As naval history, pure and simple, I think little of it, but the author had a quiet, philosophical way of summing up causes and effects in general history, as connected with maritime affairs, which not only corresponded closely with my own purpose, but suggested to me new material for thought, novel illustration. Such treatment was with him only casual, but it opened to me new prospects. It would be difficult to define precisely to what degree the art of naval warfare had been formulated or even consciously conceived in 1885. There could scarcely be said to exist any systematic treatment or extensive commentary by acknowledged experts, such as for generations had illuminated the theory of land warfare. Naval histories abounded, but by far the most part were simple narratives. Some valuable research, however, had then recently been done, notably by Captain Chevalier of the French Navy, who had produced from French documents a history of the maritime war connected with the American struggle for independence. This he followed with a less exhaustive account of the wars of the French Revolution and Empire, which also appeared in time for me to use. These were marked by running comment rather than by a studied criticism, such as that of Jomini or Napier. In Great Britain, James held, I think still holds, the field for exhaustive collection of information, documentary or oral in origin, during the period treated by him, 1793 to 1815, but he has not a military idea in his head, beyond that of downright hard fighting, punishing and being punished. In his pages, to take a tactical advantage seems almost a disgrace. The Navy Records Society of Great Britain had not then begun the fruitful labors which within the last decade and a half has made accessible in print a very large amount of new matter, nor had the late Admiral Colomb published his comprehensive book, Naval Warfare. So far as I was concerned, the old works of Ledyard, Antic, Campbell, Beatson, in French, Paul Host, Trude, Guerin, and others equally remote, had to be my main reliance, though numerous modern scattered monographs, English and French, were existent. In connection with these, one of my most interesting experiences was lighting upon a paper in the Revue Maritime et Coloniale describing in full the 4 days' battle between the English and Dutch in 1666. It purported to be, and I have no doubt was, from a personal letter recently discovered, but I subsequently found it almost word for word in the Memoire du Comte de Guiche, also a participant, printed in 1743. This review contained many able and suggestive articles, historical and professional, as did the British Journal of the United Service Institution, each being in its own country a principal medium for the exchange of professional views. Conspicuous in these contributions to naval history and thought in England were Admiral Colomb and Professor Lawton, upon the last name of whom, since these words were first written, has been bestowed the honor of knighthood, a recognition in the evening of life which will be heartily welcomed by his many naval friends on both sides of the Atlantic. In short, apart from the first-hand inquiry which I did not yet attempt, the material available in 1885 was chiefly histories written long before, supplemented by a great many scattered papers of more recent date. Before leaving this part of my experience, I will say a good word for Campbell's Lives of the Admirals, so far as his own work, down to 1744, is concerned. Under this title, it is really a history of the British Navy, very well done, for enabling a professional man to understand the naval operations. But more than this, maritime occurrences of other sorts, commercial movement, and naval policy are presented clearly and with sufficient fullness to illustrate the influence of sea power in its broadest sense upon the general history. Bearing as it does strong indications of a full use of accessible accounts, contemporary with the events narrated, I know of no naval work superior to it for lucidity and breadth of treatment. Campbell was he of whom Dr. Johnson said, "Campbell is a good man, a pious man. I am afraid he has not been inside a church for many years, but he never passes a church without pulling off his hat. This shows he has good principles." In history other than naval, I was for my objects as fortunate as I had been in Le Paris Bonfils. An accident first placed in my hands Henri Martin's History of France. I happened to see the volumes, then unknown to me, on the shelves of a friend. The English translation of Martin covered only the reigns of Louis XIV and XV, and of Louis XVI to 1783, the close of the War of American Independence. The scope of my first book, The Influence of Sea Power upon History, coincides precisely with this period, and may thus have been determined. I think, however, that the beginning of the work was fixed for me by the essentially new departure in the history of England and France, connoted by the almost simultaneous accession of Charles II and Louis XIV, while the end was dictated by the necessity to stop and take breath. Besides, I had to lecture, which for the moment interrupted both reading and writing. The particular value of Martin to me was the attention paid by him to commercial and maritime policy, as shown in those frank methods of national regulation which in the 17th and 18th centuries characterized all governments, but were to be seen in their simplest and most efficient executive operation in an absolute monarchy. A more advanced age may doubt the wisdom of such manipulation of trade, but in the hands of a genius like Colbert it became a very active and powerful force, the workings of which were the more impressive for their directness. This could be easily followed. Whatever Martin's view on political economy, he was in profound sympathy with Colbert as an administrator, and enlarged much on his commercial policy as conducing to the financial stability upon which that great statesman sought to found the primacy of his country. To one as ignorant as I was of mercantile movement, the story of Colbert's methods, owing to their pure autocracy, was a kind of introductory primer to this element of sea power. Thus received, the impression was both sharper and deeper. New light was shed upon, and new emphasis given to, the commonplace assertion of the relations between commerce and a navy, civil and military sea power. While I have no claim to mastery of the arguments for and against free trade and protection, Colbert, as expounded by Martin, sent me in later days to the study of trade statistics, as indicative of naval or political conditions deflecting commercial interchange, and influencing national prosperity. The strong interest such searches had for me may show a natural bent, and certainly conducted to the understanding of sea power in its broadest sense. Martin set my feet in the way, though Campbell helped me much by incidental mention. It is now accepted with naval and military men who study their profession that history supplies the raw material from which they are to draw their lessons, and reach their working conclusions. Its teachings are not indeed pedantic precedents, but they are the illustrations of living principles. Napoleon is reported to have said that on the field of battle the happiest inspiration is often but a recollection. The authority of Jomini chiefly set me to study in this fashion the many naval histories before me. From him I learned the few, very few, leading considerations in military combination, and in these I found the key by which, using the record of sailing navies and the actions of naval leaders, I could elicit, from the naval history upon which I had looked despondingly, instruction still pertinent. The actual course of the several campaigns, or of the particular battles, I worked out as one does any historical conclusion, by comparison of the individual witnesses presented in the several accounts. But the result of this constructive process became to me something more than a narrative. Both the general outcome and the separate incidents passed through tests which formed in me an habitual critical habit of mind. My judgments, one or all, might be erroneous, but, right or wrong, what I brought before myself was no mere portrayal, accurate as I could achieve, but a rational whole, of composite cause and effect, with its background and foreground, its center of interest and argument, its greater and smaller details, its decisive culmination. For even to a drawn battle or a neutral issue, there is something which definitely prevented success. It was the same with questions of naval policy. Jomini's dictum, that the organized forces of the enemy are ever the chief objective, pierces like a two-edged sword to the joints and marrow of many specious propositions. To that of the French postponement of immediate action to ulterior objects, or to Jefferson's reliance upon raw citizen soldiery, a mob ready disorganized to the enemy's hands when he saw fit to lay on. From Jomini also I imbibed a fixed disbelief in the thoughtlessly accepted maxim that the statesman and general occupy unrelated fields. For this misconception I substituted a tenet of my own, that war is simply a violent political movement, and from an expression of his, the sterile glory of fighting battles merely to win them, I deduced what military men are prone to overlook, that war is not fighting, but business. It was with such hasty equipment that I approached my self-assigned task, to show how the control of the sea, commercial and military, had been an object powerful to influence the policies of nations, and equally a mighty factor in the success or failure of those policies. This remained my guiding aim. But incidentally thereto I had by this determined to prepare a critical analysis of the naval campaigns and battles, a decision for which I had to thank Jomini chiefly. This would constitute in measure a treatment of the art of naval war, not formal, not systematic, but in the nature of commentary, developing and illustrating principles. I may interject, as possibly suggestive to professional men, that such current comment on historical events will lead them on, as it led me, irresistibly, to digest the principles thus drawn out, reproducing them in concise definitions, applicable to the varying circumstances of naval warfare, an elementary treatise. This I did also, somewhat later, in a series of lectures, which, though necessarily rudimentary, I understand still form a groundwork of instruction at the War College. For the framework of general history, which was to serve as a setting to my particular thesis, I relied upon the usual accredited histories of the period, as I did upon equally well known professional histories for the nautical details. The subject lay so much on the surface that my handling of it could scarcely suffer materially from possible future discoveries. What such or such an unknown man had said or done on some backstairs or written to some unknown correspondent, if it came to light, was not likely to affect the received story of the external course of military or political events. Did I make a mistake in the detail of some battle, as I got one fleet on the wrong tack in Byng's action, or as in the much argued case of Torrington at Beachy Head, it would for my leading purpose do little more harm than a minor tactical error does to the outcome of a large strategic plan, when accurately conceived. As a colleague phrased it to me, speaking of the cautious deliberation of some men, a second best position today is better than a first best tomorrow, when the occasion has passed. Strike while the iron is hot, and between reading and thinking my iron was very hot by the time I laid it on the anvil. Moreover, I had to meet the emergency of lecturing, one of the main reliances of our incipient undertaking. End of chapter 11, part 1.